We're going to move to our next keynote conversation of the day. And I'd like to welcome the U.S. Deputy Energy Secretary, the Honorable Dan Brouillette, to join me on stage for our keynote conversation. We're honored to have the Deputy Secretary with us. Deputy Secretary Brouillette previously worked at Ford and USAA. He served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs during the administration of George W. Bush. Started his political career on Capitol Hill. There's not enough bipartisanship in Washington these days, but he had the unique experience not only of working on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill, but of working on both sides of the aisle for the same member on Capitol Hill, working for Billy Tauzin before he switched from the Democratic to the Republican Party. Before his time in public service, he also served our nation in the military, where he met his wife, both of whom are Army veterans. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary Dan Brouillette to Columbia University.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for
Did I hear you say
here.
I worked on both sides of the aisle?
Well, didn't you work for Billy Tauzin when he was a Democrat?
I did. I'm just surprised that you know that.
We do our research. It's a university.
It's a university.
We have a big library right over there with all sorts of information. And we don't have enough bipartisanship in Washington, people talking to each other across the aisle. So there's so many things I want to ask you about. We don't have enough time to get to it all, but we do have a lot of students who are here. And I think we talk so much about energy policy issues in the news, from the Clean Power Plan, CAFE standards, offshore drilling. I'm not sure people fully understand what the Department of Energy actually does, what the scope of its work is, how important nuclear is as one example, and also what you do as Deputy Energy Secretary. Maybe we could start with that, and then I obviously have lots of issues I want to ask you about.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. And thanks for inviting me today. We're sincerely honored to be here with you.
Thank you.
You're doing great work here. Thank you on behalf of all of us at DOE. Thank you. Very proud of our alumni at DOE. Department of Energy is a very different sort of government agency. It's a hybrid agency. We do focus on energy policy, of course. We have offices of nuclear energy and fossil energy and energy efficiency. So we do focus on both the production of energy and the use of energy. But importantly, at the department, we have a mandate that extends all the way back to our earliest days as the Atomic Energy Commission to maintain and to manage the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. The Manhattan Project was born at the predecessor to the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy, and we still maintain that responsibility today. So as Deputy Secretary, my job sort of goes all over the place. I can talk oil one day and be in a skiff talking about a warhead the next day. So a very interesting place to be.
I think that's what we try to do at the Center on Global Energy Policy, is cover the broad range of energy policy issues. One of the policy issues that sometimes doesn't get talked about maybe as much as it should, we have discussions about where renewables and clean energy technologies are going on oil and gas, nuclear power. And so we haven't talked that much about it today so far. The U.S. Department of Energy has a review of U.S. nuclear policy underway. We do. First, tell us a little bit about what that involves, what the timing is, and what questions you're going to be trying to answer.
We're very close to releasing that study. It's still it's still a work in progress. We have an interagency process within the U.S. government that we abide by, and we have engaged all of our partners to help us to move forward on what we view is a strong future for the nuclear industry. It's had its tough times, I must say, and I must admit, U.S. Civil nuclear generation here has been in a bit of a tough spell. That being said, however, there are many, many opportunities for this industry overseas. The Secretary was just in India. He returned last night. And he had some really good conversations with the Indian government. We're excited about the opportunities that exist there. And as you may have read about, we both just returned from Saudi Arabia, separate trips. He went first. I went second to do some follow-up work to talk to the Saudis about potentially engaging with them on a civil nuclear agreement that will allow U.S. companies to do some business in Saudi. So on balance, we are excited. We recognize that there are some challenges here within the U.S., and we look forward to addressing those as well.
And in order for U.S. companies to work with the Saudis on their pursuit of civilian nuclear, that requires an agreement on the peaceful use of atomic energy, the so-called 1, 2, 3 agreement. What can you tell us about whether the U.S. is going to take a strict line and require the commitment from the kingdom not to engage in enrichment or reprocessing, or maybe compromise in order to avoid Saudi potentially turning to other countries for that technology?
Well, it's an ongoing conversation, so I don't want to get too much into the details. There's been a lot of talk around the agreement that was struck with the UAE. That's certainly something that we can look to as perhaps a model, but there are other agreements too that might serve as appropriate models. We have just begun the conversations with the Saudis. They've indicated their preferences. We are going to, as a U.S. government, stick as closely as we can to some of the existing agreements that we have in the non-pro area. We think those are very important. Saudis obviously have choices to make. They have a free and capable mind. They will make up their own decision about what technology and from who to buy from. But we hope that they will consider doing business with the U.S.
And when you look at what some other countries like the UK are doing, is it sensible for governments to subsidize new nuclear that would be out of the money without that support? Do you think the fact that the economics of nuclear don't look good in the U.S. now, is that a problem that U.S. policy should step in to try to address?
Well, where the Congress wants to spend its money is up to the Congress. But I don't foresee us as a Department of Energy advocating for subsidies, if you will, in the pure sense of, we need to give people money to build products. We will certainly use government programs to assist, and we're doing that with, the facilities down in South Carolina and in Georgia in particular. We are working closely with Southern Company. We have a program at the Department of Energy that allows for a loan guarantee. They have approached us about that. We are working closely with them. And I can foresee us moving forward on something like that, assuming, of course, the economics of the deal work. But in terms of your question is more related to things like direct subsidies, as I see some of the states are taking steps to do what are commonly known as ZECs. I don't know if the U.S. government will do that. It's more of a congressional prerogative. I don't see us doing that at the Department of Energy.
Yeah, that was part of this is the economics of new nuclear. Part of it is the economics of existing nuclear, and we're seeing some nuclear retire. That was one of the concerns that was raised when the Department of Energy asked FERC to consider a rule-making process that would compensate fuel that can be stored on site, that was often framed in the public debate, I think, as about coal, but it was coal and nuclear. I guess just to start on that, is there a grid reliability problem that we need to solve? There was a lot of response to that request to FERC saying there actually isn't a problem, and FERC reached a unanimous decision not to go down that road. Is there a grid reliability problem?
We think there will be. We're very concerned about some of the, the results, if you will, of the so-called markets that FERC has set up. We proposed, just to back up a second, we did propose at the Department of Energy what is known as a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, a NOPR in the legal parlance. And what it was a suggestion or a proposal to FERC to look at grid reliability and to more specifically take an approach that would not subsidize, but begin the process of establishing a price regulatory scheme that compensates nuclear and coal for the provision of what is known as baseload generation. So we approached it from a policy standpoint, not a single company or not a single industry standpoint. We do think that some of the subsidies that we talked about earlier, things, certain states will provide certain tax incentives for solar and wind. While they are good to initiate innovation in these types of industries, what typically happens, however, when you come to an auction market like we see here in the Northeast, it allows certain providers of electric generation to price their product at below zero pricing. So if you enter an auction at below zero pricing, then other generators, i.e. coal, nuclear, others, are going to be disadvantaged by that. Now natural gas is less disadvantaged today, obviously, because of the lower price of natural gas. But for those two baseload generators, it becomes an acute problem. And if FERC does not act very soon, we think there will be a grid reliability problem coming up.
From the expansion in the share of the energy mix of gas and renewables, even renewables with grid scale storage, that's in some ways becoming more economic.
Yeah, I think if we can get to a world in which we have better battery storage, and we're doing a lot of that work at DOE, we're moving hopefully beyond lithium. If we can get to a world where there's better storage, then I can see wind and solar becoming a bigger and bigger part, perhaps even as large a part as to become part of the baseload generation.
And so obviously FERC is undertaking an analysis now to kind of understand the grid reliability questions, decided not to act immediately on that proposed rulemaking. This has come up in another way with one bankrupt energy company, First Energy, that recently asked the DOE to use a provision in a 1935 law that allows the government to mandate power plants stay open in emergency circumstances, and President Trump said that was under consideration. Do you think First Energy's economic situation constitutes an emergency circumstance?
I don't know much about their bankruptcy filing. I can go back to what I said earlier. We're going to approach this as a public policy matter, not as an economic emergency matter for one or two companies. We're going to look at this again from the point of view of the grid, its reliability, importantly, its resiliency. So the decision that we make or the proposals that we make are going to be on that basis. First Energy is in a bankruptcy proceeding. They're going to do whatever they do in a bankruptcy proceeding. They may or may not emerge, but that's not going to drive our decisioning on this public policy.
One of the other issues around resilience, not of the grid, but not only of the grid in the energy system, are risks around cyber. The Department of Energy recently created a new office looking at cybersecurity threats and other issues with infrastructure and resilience. We saw an attack, I think, last month on a natural gas pipeline network in Texas. How big a risk is cyber attack to the U.S. energy sector? And help me understand the role of the private sector and the government and who's responsible for what to address that risk.
Sure. It can be a bit confusing on any given day. The Department of Energy is what's called a sector-specific agency. By statute, it is charged with addressing cybersecurity issues within the not only the electric sector, but the entirety of the energy sector. So we're on point for that. Those responsibilities are further spelled out in what is known as the FAST Act, which is a federal law that was passed 4, 5, 6 years ago in that time frame. We work closely with DHS and keep them apprised of what is happening in the industry. The Secretary is a part of what is called the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. So we meet with the electric company CEOs on a very regular basis. I'd say we talk perhaps as often as once a month, sometimes every other week, depending on the issue. It's a collaborative effort. We serve to advise them on what we see as the threat, because typically through the intelligence community, of which the Department of Energy is a part, we will see more specifically what is the exact threat. We try and communicate that to the industry, and then we work collaboratively because the industry owns the network itself. They own the grid, and they own the computer systems and the operating systems and the SCADA systems that manage the grid. So we can't direct them exactly what to do in any given case, but we do work very closely together to address whatever issue may be before us. We have created a brand new office at the Department of Energy to address not only cybersecurity, but emergencies. Our emergency response operations within DOE are all going to be consolidated under this new assistant secretary. When I first got to the department, I noticed that there was there were just a multitude of different organizations within our department that did, quote, cybersecurity. A lot of this is a consolidation of those offices under one management team. That office is being stood up as we speak. The President put it into his budget. The Congress acknowledged that and provided funds for it. So we're in the process of standing that up today.
And just to characterize how big, do we underappreciate how big a risk cyber is to the energy system?
In some respects, I don't know that we underestimate it. It's such a changing target. It's every single day we see a new state actor, or every single minute of every day we see a new threat that comes. So I don't know that we underestimate it. It's just it's a constant vigilance that we have to provide every single day.
I just want to step back and sort of ask a little bit broader from when what the overarching policy objective when it comes to energy from this administration. People have talked about energy dominance. The Secretary Perry has talked about new energy realism. help us understand what those terms mean. What's the goal of energy policy in this administration?
It's to increase production. It is to increase production, is to increase innovation within the energy space. We're building, candidly, we're building on a lot of the good work that you started under the Obama administration. So I go back to things like exascale computing, grid modernization. Those are all programs that began under your tenure at the Department of Energy. We're continuing some of that. We are taking perhaps a little different approach in other areas. We want to whoops, is it on?
Yep.
Is it off? We want to increase innovation within the energy space, and we're doing that in a number of different ways. We were talking to some of the laboratories. That's the other important part of Department of Energy that perhaps many don't realize. We have 17 national laboratories at the department. Many are run by universities. Cal Berkeley out in California, Stanford University runs what we call SLAC. Argonne is up in Chicago, near the University of Chicago. So we have a great partnership with universities across the country. What we want to do is use those laboratories to advance energy production here in the United States. And from an energy dominant standpoint, we do want to begin to export that product around the world. And again, building on the great work of your administration, the lifting of that export ban for crude oil was key. I think it's a seminal moment in U.S. history, and we're seeing that today.
I want to ask you about both of those. So on the innovation point, I mean, you have visited and spoken a lot about what jewels the national labs are. Secretary Perry has done the same. I think there's some perception that maybe that's inconsistent with proposing steep cuts to the R&D budget. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, we were talking about this earlier with Dr. Barol. I don't know if he's still here or not.
Over there, yeah.
There he is, right there, Dr. Barol. We were talking about this earlier. I think it's easy to look at the absolute numbers and say, well, you've reduced this $1 to 50 cents, therefore you're anti-this. And that's not what we're doing at the Department of Energy. We're moving away from applied programs. It's a philosophical difference. We're moving away from applied research more into the basic research. So, for instance, if you look at things like the solar photovoltaic technologies, I think years ago, and I don't know when it began, but many years ago, I think the government rightfully incentivized those technological developments. They're now at a point, however, that solar panels are, with all due respect, in some cases, horse and buggy or horse and whip, technology. It's ancient. Everybody is using photovoltaic technologies in the solar industry. We would like to see some initial or perhaps some additional basic research done so that we can get to the next generation of solar. And those programs are not solely within things like our energy efficiency program at DOE, which is where you saw the budget cut. We have bumped up other areas within the offices of science, which are the more basic research functions within the department. So it's a shifting more than it is an axe across the board.
Overall science budget, I think, was cut in FY18.
The president,
and RPE was
the president's
zeroed out.
budget, yes, but on the congressional budget, no, it went up.
No, that's right.
Yeah, it went up.
Right. So I think that sometimes I wanted to understand kind of what signals people should take, and it's always a negotiation. What comes out of the White House, understandably, people expect will lead to a negotiation. That was true with the prior administration too. But I just wanted to see if
that's it. I mean, I don't think we have any fundamental heartburn about the direction that we're taking. I mean, the Congress appropriated the funds. They set the budget. We understand the process. It was the president's opening mark, if you will, in a negotiation that occurs with the Congress. At the end of the day, we are the executive branch. We're charged with executing the laws that the Congress writes. We will abide by that law.
And should we understand your kind of support for basic research and kind of indication that's what the role of government should be, as strong support for RPE, notwithstanding what was in that initial budget mark? Right.
No, I think if you've heard the Secretary talk about this, he understands the importance of RPE. Again, we may have different prerogatives. We have maybe a different point of view on some of the investments that were made in RPE, but I think by and large, the program has a track record of success.
You mentioned innovation, then you also mentioned production as part of the policy goal, and I think easing of some regulations in order to help spur production has been most visible when it comes to hydrocarbons. What role does clean energy play in energy dominance?
I think, we just mentioned some of it. With regard to battery storage, we think that's, obviously a breakthrough technology. We need to incentivize in a number of different ways. We're working on right now in 2 of our labs that I'm aware of. Lithium-ion batteries are sort of the gold standard today. It's the best that we have. It's a really good technology. However, it's not getting us where we need to be on battery storage, to have these renewable technologies really take a larger place in the market. We're working with 2 of the labs to produce what we hope will be a breakthrough technology in the use of magnesium ion. Magnesium has a much denser quality about it, and the storage capacities are much higher. It's also more abundant in the world. It's easier to mine. You can find it in places that you can't find lithium. So we see that as a real step forward. That being said, if you look at the charts, solar and wind are a bigger and bigger part of electric generation in the future. If we simply do nothing, they're going to continue to increase their positioning within the market. We think that's a great thing. We think it's a great thing.
I think if you would probably ask the prior administration about the goal of energy policy, you would have heard about innovation, you would have heard about production, and you would have heard about climate change. I just want to ask from your standpoint, from this administration's standpoint, is climate change a serious threat that government policy needs to solve?
It's something we need to work on. Is it a serious threat? I think we can debate that. I don't know. I saw you just brought Dave Banks here. So I think, if I understand Dave's position, and Dave was a policy advisor to the president within the White House staff, we have some big challenges elsewhere. And right now, if we had to prioritize, this administration's, rank order of things, climate probably wouldn't be a, quote, threat at the top of the list. It is something we need to address, however. And I think, again, going back to the work of the DOE, going back to the laboratories, there's a lot of good work that's being done, and we need to continue doing it.
And what does it look like to address it? I think people see some of the regulations being eased or rolled back.
Like
aside from innovation.
Like what?
Well, I mean,
DOE regulations, or?
No, not DOE regulations.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think that there's a long list in the executive order of regulations related to the Clean Power Plan or fuel economy or other things that the president has said he would like to reverse. So I'm just, in addition to innovation, R&D, new technology, what else does this administration think government should be doing when it comes to the issue of climate change?
Well, I think what we can do, we're going to use coal for a long time. We're going to use fossil fuels for a long time. So I think developing technologies that allow us to use those fossil fuels and to use those energy resources more cleanly, more efficiently than have been done in the past is important for us to do. If you connect that to a climate change goal, that's fine. We think it's the right thing to do. So we're going to continue to do those types of work. But it's the approach that we take, it's the innovation around those technologies that we think need to advance even faster, rather than a regulatory approach that says, you must do this. And I think it's just a different philosophy that we will approach these issues with than perhaps other administrations have done.
You mentioned the importance of U.S. energy exports, and we've seen this stunning turnaround in the outlook for U.S. natural gas exports. 10 years ago was projected to increase as far as the eye could see, and we've just become a net gas exporter, and oil exports, even though we're a net importer, are still very, very high and projected to rise. Just help us understand why that's important. Why is that important why does that enhance U.S. strength economically or geopolitically when we're exporting our energy?
Because we believe strongly that energy security is national security. So if we can increase production here, and importantly, if we can export that, thank you. If we can export, I'm a springtime, I got these allergies going, I'm about to cough. If we can export those products, we think it increases the security of our allies as well and our partners around the world. We just had long conversations throughout Europe on things like Nord Stream 2. And we believe the arguments that we made there. Diversity of energy supply, diversity of energy suppliers. If you can produce your own energy and use it cleanly and efficiently, then that increases your own security. And that's the mantra that we have shared with others. We have gotten very positive feedbacks around that. There's also an entire another component around this, and that's jobs. So when we're producing here, we're creating jobs here, and that's very, very important for the U.S. economy. It makes us stronger economically. It makes us stronger in a national security sense, and that's why we're pursuing these types of policies.
And this administration has also talked about the work you're doing to enhance energy security in other ways, particularly in Europe and Europe's concerns about dependence on certain countries, notably Russia, for natural gas. This administration, like the prior administration, I should say, has been strongly opposed to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia. Is that some people have said, well, that's because the U.S. wants that market to sell more of its own gas too? Help us understand the rationale for that position.
That's part of it. I mean, we're in the export business. We have to have markets to sell to. So, of course, we'd like to see U.S. LNG be sold in Europe, and we'd like to see Europeans purchase our gas versus other, nation-state producers of gas. Our issue with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a second pipeline that would be built from Russia into Germany to serve not only Germany but other European countries, but primarily Germany at this point. We feel that the economics of that really don't make a lot of sense. There's one pipeline that already exists. There's another transit pipeline that comes through Ukraine. And there are other options available to not only Germany but other European nations. Again, getting back to that point, if you are too dependent upon one supplier or one type of energy source, you've made yourself vulnerable. So that's our going in position. That's what we're going to continue to argue for. Importantly, though, for us, with regard to the export of energy, we think that we're not only exporting oil and gas, which is important, obviously, for economic reasons. Getting back to this very fundamental point, we're exporting freedom, and that matters throughout the world.
Explain what that means. I've heard Secretary Perry say that before. What does that mean?
Well, again, getting back to it, it's just when you are secure, you have options. If you are dependent, you probably do not. So as we see aggression throughout the world, be it cyber aggression, be it kinetic aggression, as we saw in Syria last week, those types of threats are going to continue to exist, and they may increase. And if you have options, that, in our view, is going to be your strongest security position.
More options, meaning more diversity of gas supply.
More diversity of gas supply. And, the Secretary just got back last night from India. We had a great conversation with them. They just received a new shipment of LNG from the southern part of the U.S. around Louisiana and Texas. We'd like to see more of that activity occur. China and Japan.
Is there anything the government or DOE or the administration more broadly can do when you say you'd like to see more of that occur? These are you get a permit, and several projects are projected to come online because they already have their permits.
Sure.
And then there are economic decisions about whether it makes sense for people to sign those contracts. Is there anything this administration is doing or could be doing if it would like to increase volumes of exports?
No, we're just going to incentivize more facility development. I mean, we talked briefly about small-scale LNG. We've taken a couple small steps. We've initiated a couple rulemakings there to reduce, what is known as a public interest determination on the front end of a small-scale LNG. For those of you who are not familiar with the process, you had to come to DOE. We would give you a public interest determination, basically an economic analysis. And that began the process of you then going over to the FERC to get the actual permits you needed to build the facility. We decided that because these were small scale, because we're not economists at the Department of Energy for the most part, we have some very smart people, but that's not, in our view, our primary function. We just waived that requirement, said all of these are going to be in the public interest, go get your permit at the FERC. We're going to do more of that type of activity. Anything that we can do to reduce hurdles to the construction of export facilities here in the U.S., we're going to pursue.
So I think people who are trying to pursue those facilities, build those facilities, or build production, or build pipelines, or want to see increased demand growth elsewhere in the world, are worried about a possible trade war. And so can you talk a little bit about how concerned they should be and what the potential impacts of this administration's posture toward trade, what might that mean for the energy sector?
Well, I think folks are, at the moment, focused on the short term, and maybe even appropriately so. I'm not really sure. If you take the longer view, though, these are not really wars in the sense. They're a negotiation between countries and between, nations. And over time, they tend to not last very long, and they tend to work themselves out. And if you look at the long term, I think you're going to see great opportunity for U.S. business in China. Right now, it exists to some degree, but it comes at a very steep price. You must share your innovation. You must share your technology with the Chinese. It is not an option if you want to do business there. Certain products are simply not allowed. I was with Ford Motor Company prior to joining USAA, and I can tell you they would have loved to sell more Fords in China. Not allowed. And I think the president's approach, and it's obviously not my lane. We don't do tariffs. We don't do sanctions at the Department of Energy. That's for the Treasury Department, the White House to determine what they want to do. I see it as an opening bid from the president to address some of these imbalances. And I think over the long term, both the Chinese and the American economy will grow as a result.
This is not in DOE's lane, so you don't have to answer it, but I'm curious because you mentioned Ford where you previously worked, and we had the CEO of Ford come out with comments saying, we like some regulatory certainty about fuel economy standards, and we don't mind higher fuel economy standards. This administration has said it will reconsider the 2022 to 2025 increase. What are your kind of views on fuel economy standards?
On CAFE? I think, I have to take my Ford hat off. It's been long gone now. I guess I don't have to worry about taking it off too much. Look, I think, certain types of incentives within the government are good. Over the years, and coming out of the insurance business, we worked closely with the auto manufacturers and NHTSA, then the Department of Transportation, to develop standards around things like seat belts, and Americans have benefited from that. I'm not quite sure CAFE fits in that category, but I think you have to marvel at the amount of technology that's come as a result of government collaboration with the auto industry over the period of years. I happen to be a Mustang guy. I'm a car guy. I've owned old Mustangs that got 12 miles to the gallon, and it went about a third as fast as the new one. So the fact that I can buy a 650 horsepower Mustang that gets 20 plus miles to the gallon, as a consumer, that's a pretty good thing. And to the extent that government has had a role in that, then I applaud them. To the extent that it's been heavy-handed, and I don't know the latest round of conversations between the car companies and the government, to the extent it's been heavy-handed, I think we have to evaluate them. And I would expect that that's what EPA is going to do. They're going to take a close look at them. And if changes need to be made, they'll adjust. But I don't really have any strong opinion one way or the other.
One of the other things that DOE is responsible for in R&D in the Fossil Energy Office is carbon capture and storage. What are your thoughts on the role, on the outlook for CCS and on the role it is likely to play, should play in the energy mix? It's
been an important component in the oil production area. I think we have to address the economies of carbon capture and utilization, CCUS, if you will. If you talk to the coal industry today, they'll tell you it's quite expensive, and it further harms their positioning in the market to add this technology to their facilities. But I think if you talk to others, if you talk to the guys who produce shale or gas or other types of fossil fuels, they see it as a very important component. I think when I think about carbon capture, my guys are over here are going to yell at me for saying this. I just wonder if we can get to a world where, carbon is just viewed differently. Rather than viewing it as a pollutant, what if we reached a world where we viewed it as a commodity that had value? Would that change the entire regulatory structure around, the oil industry, around all of the production industry? Maybe carbon capture gets us a little closer to that world. I hope it does. And I think we should work toward it. There are a lot of people at Columbia, Alyssa Park in the engineering department, others who are working on carbon utilization research, ways to use it as a commercially valuable product. It was interesting to see in the most recent budget a tax credit for carbon capture and storage up to $50 per ton. I was wondering what your reaction to that is. Government financial incentives, subsidies effectively, does that sound like the right value for you for government to spend a ton to avoid putting a ton of CO2 in the air? I don't know about the pricing at $50. I'm not a big fan of direct subsidy. It's just my personal philosophical view. But look, in certain instances, if that's what it takes to get the market moving in a certain direction, that's going to be a decision of the American people, and I'm fine with that.
So we only have a minute or two left, and again, we do have a lot of students here who are interested in careers in government service. You've worked in the military, you've worked in public service, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue on the Hill and in the administration, as well as in the private sector. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of your advice to folks here who are interested in future careers in government.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thanks for that. My only piece of advice is don't plan. Don't plan too much. Don't overthink it, if you will. My career began in the Army, really. It was my first full-time job. My wife was an Army officer. We moved to Washington, D.C. I didn't have a political bone in my body. I really didn't understand politics at all. And a friend of mine said, what are you going to do? I said, I have no idea. He said, well, why don't you intern on the Hill? I said, but I don't know anything about politics. And he said, that's okay. Just go meet some people and things will work out. And they did. And I know that not everyone is going to pursue that path. You don't want to be as perhaps loose as I was. But my general advice would be don't overthink it. Get to know people. Get your Rolodex in order. Make a friend. Treat people with respect. Honor their service wherever it might be, and things will work out for you as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your service in government and in the military. Thank you for joining us here today and sharing your thoughts at Columbia University. Please join me in thanking Deputy Secretary Dan Brihat.
Thank you, Jason.